ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء المرسلين على سيدنا وحبيبنا مولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. اللهم آمين. My dear brothers and sisters, it is indeed a great honor and a great pleasure to be speaking here before you and to be invited by a vibrant group of young Muslims known as the YM, Young Muslims, who have left their mark throughout this country in various parts, various regions of this country, mobilizing the youth to do the good work that needs to be done, to promote Islam in the areas that it needs to be promoted, and to bring our critical mass to the masjid. So we have to recognize that we are in the presence of a good organization, and we're in the presence of many young people who have really the right intention and who have dedicated much of their life thus far to the Islamic cause. And we pray that they are among those who inshallah receive the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment, when there will be no other shade other than that which Allah ta'ala provides. Because we know from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that there will only be 7 types of people who receive this type of shade. And one of them will be the young people who dedicated their youth to serving the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and who worship their Lord in their young age. Because oftentimes the illusion of young age is that there are many years left to be lived. And the illusion of young age often tends to be that we have much time to do the good work that needs to be done. The illusion of youth often tends to be that there is a lot of time to ask Allah Ta'ala for forgiveness for the things that we have done, because right now we're only young, we're only 15 or 20 or 25, and inshallah we have another 50 years to go. But as you know, my brothers and sisters, some of you better than I do, that life is no guarantee. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not signed a contract with any one of us, and He has not said and promised to any one of us that we will live beyond a certain day or beyond a certain age. If Allah ta'ala wills, this could be the final hour which we are living here right now, right here, today. And this is why when we talk about preparing for Ramadan, when Ramadan is still about 2 weeks away, we have to begin by asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us Shahru Ramadan and its blessings, because it is not guaranteed. It is not guaranteed. It is still 2 weeks away. Anything could happen. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to extend our lives so that we may enjoy the blessings and the fruits of this blessed month. How many people we know in our own lives and in the lives of other people who between this Ramadan and between last Ramadan and this Ramadan no longer are in this world. Now they're in their graves, and the deeds that they have done are with them. But all of the things that they have worked to accumulate in this world, such as their families and their wealth, all of those things have remained behind. And at the same time, we also ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that if He gives us life for the next 2 weeks to be able to experience the joy and the blessing of Ramadan, that He also gives us the iman, the faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and its fruits, to be able to experience Ramadan in the proper way. Because that too is something that is not guaranteed. This is something that we'll constantly have to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for, to give us stability in our faith, to give us stability in our iman. Because this too is something that is not guaranteed. There are people who work in the realm of da'wah. There are people who work in the realm of da'wah. and suddenly they are confronted, for example, by an atheist. And the atheist, because of his argumentation and debate skills, perhaps confounds such an individual. And lo and behold, suddenly they go into a crisis, and they go into what is known as a faith crisis. This happens to people. I've worked with people who have had that sort of experience, right? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us iman which is stable, to give us faith which is stable, that is not fleeting, but it is something that is permanent within our hearts, and something that is permanent within our lives. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes such people when He says, ثُمَّ لَمْ يَرْتَابُوا, that the believers who believe in Allah and His Messenger, ثُمَّ لَمْ يَرْتَابُوا, then after that they do not go back. They do not go back on their heels. So we have to pray, and we have to struggle to be those people. Inshallah, the topic that I really want to focus on today in my brief time here, and inshallah I will try to keep it brief, because I know this is the evening time. Many of you have been at work all day, either at your job or playing video games. I'm just kidding. Just teasing. Don't get offended. So you must be tired by now. So I'll try to keep it short. I don't want to be like that Christian minister who once said, "I'm so sorry I went on for so long because I didn't have my watch." And somebody from the congregation said, "Yeah, but the calendar was right behind you." So inshallah, I want to keep it brief and to the point. And my point is something rather simple, yet profound, and yet something that is essential for us to understand as we enter this blessed month of Ramadan. And that is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks of Ramadan, when Allah ta'ala speaks of fasting, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الصِّيَامِ, that when Allah ta'ala prescribes fasting, the very objective of that fasting, as we heard in the beautiful recitation preceding my talk, is لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that you may be people of God consciousness. So that you may be people who are aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's presence in your lives. So that you may be people who love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are willing to detach themselves from everything that is in this world in order to be attached to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَّقُونَ. So that you may be people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know from numerous reports that taqwa, God consciousness, awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and living our lives with that type of awareness is something that resides, something that is present within the qalb, within the human heart. That it is present within the human heart. And that is where it is born, that is where it takes fruit. And all of its manifestations come from that area. The Prophet ﷺ said once in a khutbah, he said, "Taqwa hahuna, taqwa hahuna, taqwa hahuna," and he pointed to his chest 3 times. That taqwa is here, taqwa is here, taqwa is here. That taqwa is within the heart. And when we look at the descriptions that we find in the Qur'an of those people who not only don't have taqwa, but of people who have completely rejected Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala altogether and have made their hearts devoid of the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what do we hear about them early on in Surah Al-Baqarah? What is the description that we hear of such people? خَتَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ, that Allah ta'ala has sealed off their hearts. And then when we talk about the people, when Allah ta'ala speaks of the people of the hypocrites, the people who say that they believe, and yet truly they do not believe, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Again, early on in Surah Al-Baqarah, فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ مَرَضٌ فَزَادَهُمُ اللَّهُ مَرَضًا, that in their hearts is an illness, in their hearts is a disease, and because of their wrongdoing and their persistence in sinning, Allah ta'ala only increases that disease, only increases that illness by His permission. And yet when we look to the aspiring believer, when we look to the descriptions of the aspiring believer, the one who is aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the one who is conscientious of Him in his life, then what do we find of the descriptions? We find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the believers, وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانَ وَزَيَّنَهُ فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we have placed the love, وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانَ, that we have placed the love of Iman, the love of faith within their hearts. And we have made it a beautiful thing for them. وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ حَبَّبَ إِلَيْكُمُ الْإِيمَانَ وَزَيَّنَهُ. And that faith becomes something beautiful within their hearts. زَيَّنَهُ. It becomes beautiful, it becomes an ornament within their hearts. And we are told very clearly by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that on the day when all of us will have to stand before Allah ta'ala, when all of us will come before Allah ta'ala with our deeds, then there will be no one who will be successful. No one who will be successful. No one who will be successful. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ. On that day, all of the mal, all of the money that you have accumulated, and all of the children that you have accumulated, all of the progeny that you have worked hard for, none of them will be of benefit to you. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا, except man, the one, أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, except the one who comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with a heart that is sound, with a heart that is pure, with a heart that is at peace and at tranquility with its Lord. So we see that this is of utmost importance. Now what we have to realize, my brothers and sisters, is the fact that there are many illnesses and many diseases that are present within our hearts. Not because we are bad people, but because this is the very nature of the human being. And the human being was not created as an angel. The human being was created into the earth to toil and to struggle. And if we did not have these spiritual illnesses and these spiritual blemishes within our hearts, then there would be no point to toiling and to struggling. There would be no fruits and there would be no joy in attaining nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is only after we work hard and we sweat that what we achieve by that hard work we actually enjoy and that we actually find pleasure in. So we have these illnesses within our hearts and we have to recognize what these illnesses are, and this is one of the first things that we have to do to purify the heart, to make it a place, to make it a residence of taqwa, to make it a residence of God consciousness. That we have to recognize what these ailments are. And then when we recognize what these ailments are, we have to recognize that each one of us are given particularly difficult challenges in life. One person might have the spiritual ailment of anger, that they see the world with anger and that they experience anger all the time. This is a spiritual ailment. Another person might have no problems with anger. In fact, nothing makes them angry. Yet they have over-excessive love of money or over-excessive love of other things that distract from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So every human being has these distractions. Every human being has these illnesses that they need to overcome. And we need to recognize what those illnesses are. And then part of our struggling, part of our journeying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to figure out how we get rid of, how we root those illnesses out of our hearts. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَجَاهِدُوا فِي اللَّهِ حَقَّ جِهَادٍ, that strive in the way of Allah as Allah ta'ala deserves to be striven for. It means partly what it means, and at its very root what it means is that we need to struggle within our own selves and within our own hearts to identify those things that keep us away from Allah, and then we need to figure out how to get rid of those things. But in the last few minutes that I have, I just want to offer some essential and basic tools. And Ramadan is a good place to begin if we have not already begun that journey. But Ramadan is also a place to continue that journey if we have already started that journey of purification of the heart. And the analogy that I want to present to you is that of gardening. How many of you have experienced gardening? Don't be shy. It's not only a woman's duty to garden. Okay, a good healthy number of you have experienced gardening. Okay. But if you have not experienced it, then perhaps the analogy that I offer to you, these are some tips that you can write down when you have a garden, either in this world or in the hereafter. Whenever you get a garden, right? Inshallah, these are some tips that you can keep in mind. So if you look at a garden, and you're the owner of a garden, you'll find that one of the first things that you have to do to beautify that garden and to keep that garden healthy is that you have to get rid of the weeds. Everyone know what weeds are? Weeds are those ugly things that come out of the soil that are not meant to be there. So you plant these beautiful flowers, and instead of the beautiful flowers, what you find are these weeds, right? So the first thing you've got to do is that you've got to pull these weeds out of the garden. You've got to pull these weeds out of the garden. Now our heart is like that garden, and the weeds are like the spiritual ailments that are present within our hearts. And to pull them out, the idea of pulling them out is all about the idea of tawbah. All about the idea of tawbah, of returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness. Because we see that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said that if somebody sins and then they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness in the proper manner and in the most sincere fashion, then it is as if they did not sin. So it is as if the weeds never existed. And what is tawbah all about? We know that the month of Ramadan is all about tawbah. That the month of Ramadan is all about returning to our Lord, returning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the most sincere way. We know that the first 10 nights of Ramadan are about Allah ta'ala's mercy. They are about receiving Allah ta'ala's grace. We know that the next 10 are about receiving Allah ta'ala's forgiveness. We know that the last 10 are about receiving Allah ta'ala's freedom from the hellfire. Right? So all of these things indicate the importance of Ramadan and our ability to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and seek Allah ta'ala's forgiveness and to pull out these weeds one by one. One by one we pull out these weeds that are there before us. But it's not enough to pull out the weeds. It's not enough to pull out the weeds. You also got to do something else. You've got to put in the place of the weeds, you need to spray what they call weed killers. What they call weed killers. And now they have eco-friendly weed killers, so you don't have to worry about destroying the environment. But essentially when you spray these eco-friendly weed killers, then what happens is that the place that the weeds once grew where you pulled them out, those places, it becomes more difficult for the weed to grow once again. And the analogy of this is the fact that the Prophet ﷺ said, remember often the destroyer of pleasures. And when the Prophet ﷺ said, remember often the destroyer of pleasures, what he meant is dhikratul maut. To remember maut, to remember death, to remember the impending death that is looming over each and every single one of our heads. The fact that we don't know how long we're going to live. And the fact that we as people of Iman and people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do not want to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala except in a state of remembrance and except in a state of surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah ta'ala even commands us when He says, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu taqullaha. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu taqullaha. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu taqullaha. Essentially, حَقَّ تُقَاتِهِ وَلَا تَمُوتُنَّ إِلَّا وَأَنْتُمْ مُسْلِمُونَ. That do not die, oh you believe, do not die except in a state of surrender to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reality is that we never know when this death is upon us. So the more that we remember death, not to be people of morbid people, not to be people who are depressed, so that if you walk up to somebody and you say, Salaamu Alaikum, and they say, what happened to you? I'm remembering death. Don't talk to me. That's not the point. The point is not to be morbid. The point is not to despair and to be depressed. But rather, it's to be people who are motivated to take advantage of the time that we have. To take advantage of every single moment we have. So that in fact, when somebody says, Assalamu alaikum, we respond with an even stronger wa alaikum assalam and an even more enthusiastic smile. Because we know that the Prophet ﷺ said that to smile is charity. And if we die in that next moment, we want to die having given charity, no? Yes, we want to die having given charity for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if we're down, we respond with this beautiful smile and salam. So, dhikratul maut. And then on top of that, if you want to get rid of, make sure that the weeds don't come back, you put this layer of plastic carpeting on top of it. And the analogy of this is all other types of dhikr that we have. All other types of remembrance. And there are three essential ones that I want to point your mind and your heart to. The first is to remember your own self, your own state. What is your state? What is your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And where do you need to go in your journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? So, remembrance about yourself and your state. The second is a reflection and a remembrance of the heavens and the earth as a way of coming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to reflect on the nature of the sun and the moon and the earth and all of these things that are there as manifestations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah ta'ala in many ayat says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, that the entire universe has been set up for us to be a sign. To be a sign of Allah ta'ala's lordship and a sign of Allah ta'ala's mercy in the universe. So the more we reflect on this, the more we draw near to Allah, the more that we are able to prevent these ailments within the heart from coming back. And then the third type of remembrance is the remembrance of the Qur'an and the remembrance of the way of His beloved Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there is no month that is greater and that is better for engaging in the remembrance of the Qur'an in a most intimate way than Shahru Ramadan, than the beautiful month of Ramadan. Fihi, in it was revealed the Qur'an. Shahru Ramadan alladhi unzila fihi al-Qur'an hudan lin-nasi wa bayyinatin min al-huda wal-furqan. That in this month the Qur'an was revealed, and it is a guide for human beings, and it is a criterion between what is right and what is wrong, between the truth and the falsehood. And so reflection on the Qur'an, and the more that we reflect on the Qur'an, we find that our spiritual ailments not only go away, but they stay away. The point is not only to root it out, but to keep it out. And then the final thing that I want to say, my brothers and sisters, about this idea of purification of the heart and how it relates to Ramadan and how we prepare for this blessed month that is coming up, is that once you've pulled out the weeds and you've put the weed killer and you've put the plastic carpeting, that's not enough. The final thing that you want to do to beautify this garden is that you want to put in the place of those weeds, you want to put some beautiful things. So some people, they put some mulch. You know mulch? It's this brown, beautiful looking sand. You know, you put it around, it looks nice. So at one point there was this ugly weeds, now you put these beautiful brown mulch. It looks very nice. Or you can plant a flower, or you can plant a tree, or you can put a bird bath. Whatever you want. It's your garden. Do whatever you want. Enjoy. But the analogy of this is that it's not enough to pull out the weeds and to get rid of those things that remove us from Allah Ta'ala, but what we need to do is to replace them with something that is good and something that is beautiful. And the greatest of those things is the remembrance of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala and the doing of good deeds. The doing of good deeds. And this is how we beautify our hearts, by doing good deeds. We hear about the descriptions of the Prophet ﷺ that he was the most generous of human beings. That he was the most generous of human beings. This is one of the descriptions of Rasulullah ﷺ. And then the Sahaba, they say, but in the month of Ramadan, he was even more generous than his usual generous self. You see. So there are people, they're really good. But there's certain occasions they're even better. And you see this in every aspect. And I don't want to demean it, but to give you an analogy, maybe the younger people will relate to this a little bit. You know, on any given night, LeBron James is pretty good, right? But then he gets to the playoffs, well, not this last time, but usually when he gets to the playoffs, he does even better. You see. So in every field of life, this is true. That there are people who are good, but they get even better. They even surpass their own qualifications. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he was the most generous of human beings. But in the month of Ramadan, he was even more generous. And so to do righteous deeds, to be people of generosity, to be people who are smiling, to be people who give comfort to those who are sick, to be people who go to the hospital and visit those who are sick, especially the Muslims who are sick and they have no family and they have no friends, to go to the soup kitchen and to feed the people who are hungry, the people who have lost their jobs, to feed them with our own hands and to give them suhbah, to give them company, to go to Habitat for Humanity and to help build up the roof for a people who do not have shelter. All of these things are from the good deeds that not only keep away those weeds, that not only keep away those illnesses within our hearts, but they actually replace them with something that is beautiful and something that is permanent and something that is beneficial for us, not only in this world, but into our graves and onto the day of judgment and into the hereafter. That is the ultimate and the true fruit and benefit of having a heart that is pure. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. On that day, there will be people of no benefit, neither the wealth nor the children, except the people who come with qalbun salim, with a heart that is purified. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us such a heart. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us a life that is long enough to experience the joy and the blessings of this upcoming Ramadan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in our faith and to maintain our faith and to stabilize our faith so that we are able to experience Ramadan as it should be experienced. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us people who work day in and day out to purify our hearts and especially intensify that during the month of Ramadan. And I want to conclude, my brothers and sisters, on just one piece of thought, which is that if you think about it, there are so many spiritual ailments, from anger to hatred to jealousy to all of these things that remove us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imagine if over the course of a lifetime, we make the commitment that every year we would tackle one of those spiritual ailments, that we would tackle one of those bad behaviors that are present within the human heart and within the human character and the manifestation thereof. And we began with that which we have most difficulty for. And so imagine if we did this and we live to be, if we live 30, 40, 50, 60 more years, or even 5 more years. Imagine coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having gotten rid of those spiritual ailments as opposed to coming to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with those spiritual ailments still existing within our hearts. So we have to take advantage of Ramadan. We have to take advantage of Ramadan, but not only Ramadan. We have to take advantage of the bounce that Ramadan gives for the rest of the year. We have to take advantage of the bounce that Ramadan gives for the rest of the year. Because it's not about Ramadan, it's about Ramadan giving us the energy to do what is good and to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the rest of the year that is coming. So inshallah, let us prepare for that. I know there might be some questions, hopefully not. But if there are, then inshallah we'll take some. And the real joy, the real fruits of this are still upcoming with our Ustadh Yaser, who will inshallah talk more about our relationship with the Qur'an. And so maintain your attention of heart and mind for that.